Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. Status in today's world does not run on street cred anymore. It's all about how many likes and retweets or followers you have. You don't have to be the toughest kid on the street anymore to be the coolest. But it also means that if you are the one being bullied, it doesn't stop when you go home. Lee Duffy did not grow up in this world. When he was a kid, the more people you could beat up, the less you got beat up on. And this was a kid who got beat up on a lot. And as cliche as it sounds, to tell you the story right, we have to start right at the very beginning. Lee Duffy was born on June the 11th, 1965 in Middlesbrough. When he was a toddler, his parents would move him to the South Bank, where he would spend the rest of his life. To put it bluntly, Mr Duffy had a terrible childhood, both in and out the home. His father was a stereotypical working class drunk, who would come home and put a hand on his wife and children. It is reported that at one point, he pushed his wife out of a window and broke her collarbone. Though we are not sure how she died, one thing we do know is that Mr Duffy prevented his children from attending her funeral. This is just one instance of the psychological damage that Mr Duffy inflicted on his children. Unwittingly, he was also teaching them that if you wanted something, you had to fight for it. Literally. This would lay the framework for how Lee dealt with his conflicts later on in life. He didn't have it any easier outside the home. He was bullied relentlessly at school for the size of his head and for the size of his lips. Reportedly, the kids would make fun of him and say that he looked like he had a disability. He was a skinny boy growing up, and when puberty hit, he only got a little bit taller, not much stronger. When he was 14, he was jumped by 6 guys and he wasn't strong enough to defend himself. This was a turning point. Mr Duffy now realised if he wanted to stop being bullied, he would have to become the bully. As a young lad, Mr Duffy dropped out of school, and he ended up trying to enroll in trade school so that he could work with his hands. But the South Bank is not an easy place to find a job, and it is arguably one of the hardest places to grow up in. Mr Duffy soon gave up on trying to stay on the straight and narrow, and quickly fell into the world of drugs. It started out by using drugs here and there, until it turned into what some would call an addiction. From there, he got involved in selling.
By all means, Mr Duffy moved fast up the food chain. He did this mostly through fear tactics. When he decided he was done being picked on, he started to bulk up, going to the Grinchtown Boys Club regularly to lift weights.
And it was now that Mr Duffy decided that it was time to take over the Middlesbrough criminal underworld.
He had finally hit the physical size that he wanted to be, and his newfound strength and profession as a criminal, Mr Duffy was now ready to do some serious damage. He used his size to intimidate his competitors, and he wasn't afraid to resort to a brutal fight in order to prove his point. Some people believe that he was born with a slightly longer than average arm, and this helped him in his fights. There is some credibility to this theory, given that before he bulked up, Mr Duffy was considered by friends to be lanky. Speaking of his fights, many people referred to Mr Duffy as a boxer, but no one would label him that today in today's standards. He occasionally fought for money, but never in a professional setting. Mr Duffy is better described as a strongman or a thug. Mr Duffy's strength is what made him notorious, being referred to as a crime boss and the most feared man in Middlesbrough. He went from being a small child who couldn't defend himself to someone who was feared solely because of his strength and temper. Mr Duffy's violent temper was out of control, and it eventually landed him in prison. Whilst in prison, he met many notorious figures from the UK criminal underworld, who still remember Mr Duffy and his antics to this day. Whilst locked up, Lee Duffy had lifted more weights and became more confident with his fighting skills. Although he got into a lot of fights, Lee Duffy managed to keep his head down and was released from prison in May of 1990. Whilst he was still inside, he bumped head with another man who was well known in the Middlesbrough criminal underworld. Because Mr Graham was so well known in the Middlesbrough criminal underworld, Mr Duffy had picked him as his sworn enemy, determined to bait him out into a fight. This man was Viv Graham. Mr Graham was a businessman who knew how to intimidate his competition. He was not a man to be walked over and decide once for all who was the better man and the real king of the Middlesbrough criminal underworld. Unfortunately for Mr Duffy, this ultimate match was never to be. Mr Graham had a business to run and common sense between his ears. Despite the numerous invitations from Mr Duffy to set up a fight, Mr Graham had no interest whatsoever. There are several theories as to why Mr Graham had no interest in fighting Mr Duffy. Some suspect that he knew he was the superior man and felt he had nothing to prove. Others believe that the reverse is true, that Mr Graham was scared to lose his status to Mr Duffy by literally losing in a fight. Regardless of the reason, he refused to face Mr Duffy in a contest of strength. For Mr Duffy, who was now dependent on drugs, this was the ultimate insult. He started to spend every weekend in Newcastle where Mr Graham lived. He was always high and drunk and looking for a fight. Supposedly, he once took on 4 bouncers outside one of Mr Graham's nightclubs, hoping to get his attention. During the 15 months that Mr Duffy was free, police said they received over 96 complaints that pointed right back to Mr Duffy. Some of the complaints were related to his attempts to get at Mr Graham, but not all of them were. Sometimes these complaints occurred in and around the nightclubs of Middlesbrough. These altercations typically happened when Mr Duffy felt his honour was attacked or his character was being called into question. A man whose life rested on his entire reputation, he had to take these matters very seriously. Mr Duffy's violent temper was clearly spiralling out of control, and the drugs only made it worse. Whenever he showed up somewhere, people would either leave simply out of fear or because they knew he would cause trouble. It started to become common knowledge in and around Middlesbrough that violence followed Mr Duffy wherever he went. More than a few people reported that simply just by walking by a door, Mr Duffy had scored the entire mood of the crowd. There had been 3 previous attempts on Mr Duffy's life. He had been shot twice. The third attempt on Mr Duffy's life is when he had petrol poured over the top of him. His friends started describing him as the Terminator because he always came back. And of course, after multiple attempts on his life, this only contributed to more drug taking and more violent altercations from Mr Duffy. Unfortunately for Mr Duffy, his violence was about to be his undoing. On August the 24th, 1991, Mr Duffy went to a club high on cocaine, weed and ecstasy. While he was there, he ran into a man called David Allison, an old friend of his. Really, an ex-friend to be more accurate. They had been buddies growing up, but their relationship had soured as Mr Duffy's infamy had grew around Middlesbrough. When Mr Duffy pulled up to the club, he and Mr Allison were still on very bad terms, and everybody knew it. Multiple eyewitness accounts say that the mood went very sour as soon as Mr Duffy walked in. No one knows exactly who started it, but the two started yelling at each other in the club. This caused a mass exit of the building as people did not want to be inside when this fight broke out. However, the pair were ordered to go outside and take their argument out there. Once the altercation was taken outside the club, although it had started off verbal, it very soon turned physical, with Mr Duffy having the upper hand like he always did in most fights. He was banging Mr Allison's head on the ground, not letting up for even a second to breathe. To everyone around him, it seemed like once again Mr Duffy was proving his power and bullying someone else who dared to disagree with him. There were plenty of spectators who were all there to fuel Mr Duffy's ego. However, some people started to flee because they feared Mr Duffy was going to kill Mr Allison and they did not want to be a witness. However, no one could have guessed what came next. One of Mr Allison's friends slipped him a knife while he was on the ground, and he quickly lunged his knife upwards into Mr Duffy's side, dropping him to the ground. Everyone who was watching the fight quickly scattered, with only a few people sticking around to call an ambulance. Despite being rushed to hospital, Mr Duffy died at 3:55 AM on August the 25th, 1991. Many people believed that no one would turn Mr Allison in. This was due to fears of being dragged into the situation themselves. However, in a shocking turn of events, Mr Allison confessed to the crime himself and handed himself in, and after a trial he was fully acquitted after claiming it was in self-defense. Lee Duffy is one of the most infamous UK criminals, especially in the northern criminal underworld. Some loved him some feared him, and many despised him. No matter what your opinion of him, Lee Duffy is gone, but it will never be forgotten. There are numerous books and movies about him. One most recently released is The Whole Moon. All of the books and movies are an attempt to help Mr Duffy live on forever and try to understand just who Mr Duffy really was. Some say Mr Duffy was a really good man and he just got swept up into the nightlife at the time. Others say that Mr Duffy was a bully and that's all he knew. He most certainly would not be the only person who grew up in such a way in the Middlesbrough criminal underworld. One of Lee Duffy's closer friends, Lee Harrison, also fell into this lifestyle. However, he managed to make a success of himself and become an MC. He was better known as Hooligan X and was somewhat of a famous MC at nightclubs in the area. We will be making a documentary on Mr X very soon, so please keep a lookout for that. Hooligan X and Mr Duffy had lived in the area their whole life, so it was no surprise that they both end up being caught up in the drug world. While Mr Duffy made a name for himself as a fighter, Hooligan X became a DJ and an MC. Many people believe that both men died well before their time because of their fast-paced lifestyles. According to some, Mr Duffy knew that he would die young and chose to live the life the way he did because of that very reason. Maybe that's the reason why Mr Duffy is still a symbol for many young men who are in his position today. Regardless of the reason, Lee Duffy is a man who, especially in Middlesbrough, will never be forgotten. What are your opinions of Lee Duffy? Was he really a bully and a thug that many knew him as? Or was he just a young man who was struggling to express himself and had a very bad childhood? Please let us know in the comments below. If you like this content, please don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and until next time, stay safe.